Keep the no. Keep the clapping and cheering to a minimum, or you won't hear me at all. Okay. Can you hear what I'm saying? Okay. Right. Well, thank you all very, very much for coming out on this terrible night to my book launch. I've got friends, ex-colleagues from work, writers from my writers group, readers from my readers group. I've got family and friends of family. Thank you all very, very much for coming along. And thank you, Sparsile, for putting up with all my crap over these years. All the fights over edits. I mean, the Oxford comma, give me a break, you know. So I'm going to try and describe why the hell I wrote this book, which is, you know, the Bamboo Cocoon. It's a thriller, a spy thriller, and it's about 4 generations of Chinese spies and gangsters. So I think the first thing I've got to try and explain to you is what the hell I was doing writing about a family of Chinese. Well, the reason is, if we're talking about spying, that the kind of recruitment strategies for Western intelligence has undergone a bit of a sea change over the past 20 years. Now, when the enemy was the good old Soviet Union, you could recruit sort of middle class or upper class white boys at Oxford and Cambridge. You could teach them how to speak Russian or Czechoslovakian, and they could pass as Russian or Czechoslovakian. But now the big enemy is China, and they're not going to pass as Chinese, so, which is why the intelligence services in the West have been recruiting people of Chinese descent. So I needed, if I was going to talk about the present threat from China, I needed a Chinese family, and I wanted to look at how the relationship between Britain and China has changed over 100 years, and that's where the 4 generations came in. Now, it's a crash bang thriller, okay? It's a lot of excitement, hopefully it's interesting, hopefully amusing. But the books I write always do have some deeper message at their heart. There's a bee that I've got in my bonnet that I've got to get out, and you're a captive audience tonight. You're getting the bee full in your face, all right? And the reason I wrote it was because of 2 trips I made to mainland China. One was 10 years ago, and one was 4 years ago. And the difference I saw between those 2 visits, I found profoundly shocking. I really did. And I felt I had to write something about it, about the danger of China. It really is the biggest threat we face to our way of life. I'll try and describe what it was like. So 10 years ago, I came in on the Trans-Mongolian Express, a really romantic train journey. Takes you from Siberia through Mongolia and then into China. You go from the barren pine forests of Siberia to the Mongolian steppes, and then you go through the Gobi Desert and down into China. It's about half a mile long train. It travels at 30 miles an hour for day after day, for 1,000 mile after 1,000 mile. So it's a bit of a difficult journey in some ways. And I was afraid I would never get to sleep. I'm a very bad sleeper. And I was on this rackety old train that was about 200 years old. And we don't have the nice welded lines we have in the UK. It's the old sections of track bolted together with the little gap in the middle. So every time a wheel went over it, it went chuggada, right? So thousands of miles, day after day, chuggada, chuggada, chuggada. And I was also stuck in a little carriage, little cabin, with 3 other people who were complete strangers. And after 3 days of living with them, they weren't so strange after all. Well, they were very strange, in fact. So I thought, I'm never going to sleep. I'm crowded in this place. I'm on this rackety old train. But I found I would just lay my head back, close my eyes, sometimes in the middle of a conversation, and I would go unconscious like that, bang. And I was unconscious for 8 hours, and then I would wake up. And this happened every time. I made the mistake of closing my eyes, even in mid-sentence sometimes. And I think the reason it was the best sleep I've had in my life, it was the chuggada chuggada. I think it must have reminded me of my mother's heartbeat when I was in the womb or something primal like that. So it was good in that way, but it was kind of tough in others, and I'll give you one example. When the train came to the border between Mongolia and China, it couldn't go any further because the track gauge, the width of the tracks, was different. So you'd think you would pull up at the border on one train, get off, cross the border, get on another train and head off. But that's not what they do at all. They pull this half-a-mile engine into a half-a-mile shed. They hydraulically jack up the first 2 carriages, take the wheels out, put the new wheels in, lower it, shunt the train along, do this for a half-a-mile train, so it takes 10 hours. Now that's okay if you're Chinese or Mongolian because they let you off the train, but we were, you know, distrusted Westerners, so we were confined to 2 carriages and they locked us in during this 10-hour period. But there was another slight wrinkle because it's an old train, so the bathrooms empty onto the tracks, but you can't be emptying onto the tracks in this shed all over the hydraulic gear. So before they left, they helpfully locked the bathroom doors. So we were stuck there for 10 hours now, and we couldn't sleep because of all the shunting and the noise. And as time gone on, it became more and more difficult. But for the guys, there were bottles we could use. But for the women folk, I'm afraid there wasn't that facility. So as the night wore on, they got greyer and greyer and greyer. And then finally in the morning, we pulled into the station. The door was opened. It was like a stampede of wildebeest, you know, knocking aside the poor Chinese, trying to get to the bathroom. So it's quite a hard journey in some ways. But the point is what China looked like when we actually started to go through it. We came down through the Gobi Desert. And the first thing you see are little kind of adobe huts, which are shaped like beehives. And then you get through hamlets, and then you get to villages and towns and cities, and the mega cities, the 20 million or so inhabitants that are becoming very common in China nowadays. And my overwhelming impression was how dirty and dingy it was. There was litter everywhere, there were piles of rubbish in the streets, the dogs were nosing away at them, people were dressed in old soiled clothing, every window was dusty and needed cleaning. When we passed through the countryside, the farms were little hovels where people lived, so it was pretty bad. And it didn't disabuse me of the notion that my patronising notion that I was a first world citizen visiting a developing world country. But then I went 4 years ago with the family, and we travelled for thousands of miles through China, and it was like chalk and cheese. It had completely changed, and this is where I began to sense that something really significant was going on. For a start, the place was spotlessly clean, and I think what happened is Xi Jinping must have woken up one morning and said, well, we're going to be ruling the earth for the next 100 years. We should look like rulers. So overnight he employed 1 million Chinese, usually retired people, gave them brooms and coolie hats and told them to sweep the streets. So the place was spotless, and there's 1.4 billion Chinese live in China, and they're not the tidiest of people, but it looks certainly a lot cleaner than Glasgow does. But that's just the cosmetic changes. There are far more profound changes that have happened. In the last 10 years, China has laid down 30,000 kilometres of high-speed rail line. In the last 10 years, we've laid down none. In the last 10 years, they built 100 new airports, whereas us, for the past 30 years, have messed around trying to get a 3rd runway at Heathrow. They have invested massively in things like artificial intelligence, robotics, space travel, cloning. They are moving ahead of us now. And that was the problem. I had gone as a snotty first world citizen, but I returned from there as a second world citizen coming back to this second world country. So I was really startled by how much China had developed, how it had overtaken us in so many ways. And it's not just in terms of technology and infrastructure. The standard of living of the Chinese has improved massively. Barely 25 years ago, one human generation, 750 million Chinese lived in absolute poverty. That's defined, by the way, it is a thriller, it's action-packed, this is just me giving you the background. 750 million Chinese lived in absolute poverty, which is defined as less than $1 a day. Nowadays, none of them do. Now that they live far, far better lives, much better education, much better healthcare. So it sounds like I'm a real fan of China. In many ways I am, because these are the biggest improvements to human standard of living to so many people in the history of the world. But the reason they've been able to do this is because they don't have the kind of niceties of freedom of expression and democracy that we have in the UK. It is a totalitarian system in conjunction with a capitalist economy, really. And so, for example, if they want to lay down 30,000 kilometres of high-speed rail line, has someone got a chair for? Yeah, if they want to lay down 30,000 kilometres of high-speed rail line, they lay it down, and the people who live along the track have got to move. They might be compensated, but they don't have all the things that we can do in the UK. We can object in the courts. If we lose, we can appeal and then appeal to a higher court. We can get the public on your side. You can get the newspapers interested. You can do all sorts of things to prevent developments. But in China, they don't have that choice. So there aren't the freedoms of expression that we have. There isn't the freedom generally. Now we have this conceit in the West that when the Chinese become as rich as us, they will want all of these freedoms that we know and love so much. And I actually talked to some Chinese about this in China, and they kind of laughed at me. And one of them said, when my mother 50 years ago was in the country and Mao was in charge, he made a massive disastrous error with centralized planning of agriculture, and 40 million people starved to death in China. And she was saying that her mother could only live by eating grass and the bark from the tree. She said that was the problem my mother faced. My biggest problem is deciding what model of iPhone to buy. So like in 50 years, there's been an absolute sea change. So, and it's working so well, it's made them so much wealthier. It's making them world rulers eventually. That I don't think we should hold our breath in hope that there's going to be a change in terms of democracy or freedom of expression in China anytime soon. So the background was China scared the bejesus out of me, and I wanted to write a book about it to try and explain why that was. And I wanted to examine how the power relationship between Britain and China has changed over 100 years, because 100 years ago we were top of the heap and China was down there. Now it's completely changed. So the earliest part of the book is set in the 1890s in Shanghai, a wicked, wicked city. And Shanghai is important because of what we, the British, did to Shanghai and to China. Back in the 1890s, the British government and all the companies in Britain became very concerned because all our money was flowing to China. We were buying the porcelains and the silks and the tea. So we were losing money to China. So we needed a commodity that we could sell to the Chinese in order to make up for this. And the product we decided to sell was opium. We grew opium in our farms in India, used our ships to transport it to China, and Shanghai was the gateway to China. And we were very, very successful in selling opium to China, to the point where, after we started this, 10 million Chinese became addicted to opium. Now, if you live in a Western country with a nice healthcare system, you can be addicted to opium and survive. But if you're poor and in China, you generally die. So millions of Chinese died because of our drug pushing. And the Chinese got a bit upset about this, so they blockaded their own ports with their wooden sailing vessels to prevent our drug ships from coming into Shanghai. And the British government got incensed about this. How dare the Chinese do this? So we sent our ironclad warships to blow the Chinese wooden navy to matchwood. And the Chinese, even though they outnumbered us 20-1, had to surrender, had to agree to continue to allow us to import opium into China. And also as recompense for our inconvenience, we took Hong Kong for 100 years. So I wanted to set part of my story in that time to illustrate how badly we behaved to China. And then later on, another generation is the mother of my main protagonist, and she's working as an actress in the Hong Kong film industry in the 1970s. Because again, this was a great hotbed of spying, and it's also to illustrate again how badly the British treated Chinese people. We governed Hong Kong for 100 years, but we never allowed democracy. We never allowed the freedoms that we take for granted in the UK. And we used a massive kind of intelligence network to tap every single phone call from Hong Kong to abroad, and also open every single piece of mail to try and make sure that people weren't trying to establish a democratic movement. We were, as bad as the Chinese are today in terms of stamping down on democracy. So there was a lot of spying in those days in the Hong Kong film industry, because we didn't know what was happening in China. At that stage, as I say, 40 million people were dying from starvation, 10 million people were being murdered. And in order to find out what was happening, we got hold of the refugees that came from China and worked in the Hong Kong film industry to find out what was going on in China. Because Mao's Cultural Revolution was essentially trying to kill off anyone who could articulate arguments against his policies, which meant, generally speaking, intellectuals and artists. They were either murdered or they were exiled to provinces where they had to work on farms for the rest of their lives. But some escaped across the Pearl River Delta into Hong Kong and got jobs in the film industry. So our spies were there to try and find out who they were and then find out what was happening in China. And that's really the only mechanism we had to see beyond the bamboo curtain in those days. Again, it's all very heavy, but hopefully it's interesting, because the Hong Kong film industry at that time was wild. It was racy. I mean, they were very prurient about sex and nudity, but when it came to violence, there were no limits at all. So, for example, if the film required a scene where a dog was shut in a cellar with 1,000 starving rats, that's what they would film, no CGI. And similarly, there was no limit to the violence that one human being could inflict on another. But I won't give you examples, you've probably just eaten, you know. But there's some of it in the book. So it's a racy time to write about, and I really enjoyed it. And then the rest of the book is set in the present day. It's the son. He's been an orphan, and part of the book is detective work, trying to find out about these previous 3 generations, and he finds out more than he had bargained for. And he, again, works for the British in China and also in Taiwan. A lot of the book is set in Taiwan. Taiwan's a wonderful island. It was originally called Formosa, which means beautiful island in Portuguese. It's like Hawaii. It's a volcanic island that rises steeply out of the Pacific, with the mountainsides jungle shrouded and mist shrouded. It's a very, very beautiful place, and the people are very nice as well. It's a democracy, and they're nice to the point almost of being naive. But unfortunately, they are in the way of China. China claims Taiwan. It's never ruled Taiwan, but nonetheless, it claims it. There are 20 million Taiwanese, 1.4 billion Hong Kong Chinese across the Taiwan Strait. So they're in a lot of trouble. It's probably going to be the sparking point for the Third World War if Ukraine isn't before it. Because Xi Jinping at his big conference recently said that, again, that he had not ruled out using force to reclaim Taiwan. And unfortunately, Joe Biden has also said that the Americans will use force to prevent such an invasion. So it clearly is a flashpoint for a possible Third World War. So that's the background against which all these spies operate. It's a lot lighter than I've maybe presented here, but that is the foundation on which it is based. Now, I'll read a short extract, only a few minutes, and then you can ask me as many impertinent questions as you like. This section is from the Shanghai days, so 1895, and it's the great-grandfather of my protagonist. His name is Jun, and he's a gangster working on the opium dens, and unfortunately he has killed a Frenchman, which is a very, very bad move, because the French, and particularly the British, essentially ruled Shanghai in those days. And they were able to keep control because they paid the Green Gang, this very large gang of gangsters, to keep the Chinese population in check. So by killing a Frenchman, he has disgraced the Green Gang, and they want to kill him to make it up to the Frenchman. So he has got to flee Shanghai big time, or he's going to be wiped out. And what he does is he stows away aboard a vessel, a wooden sailing vessel, which is going back to Britain. It's a British vessel. All the crew are British except for the cook, whose name is Ping. So the only 2 Chinese on board, and they become friends. And this bit is where they sail around the Cape of Good Hope. Now, I used to be in the Merchant Navy many, many years ago. It was the equivalent of my gap years But so long ago that phrase hadn't even been invented. But I've sailed in seas like this, and I've always wanted to try and describe them, about how awful they are. I mean, I think the best description was a Ralph McTell lyric, which went something like, "Does anyone know where the love of God goes when the waves turn the minutes to hours?"
Barrie, that's not Ralph McTell. It's Gordon Lightfoot.
Yeah, that's the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, right?
Gordon Lightfoot.
Yeah, okay. Right, so
I told him I was going to haggle.
So the title of this short piece is The Great-Grandfather John and the Eloquent Shrug. Ping had warned him about the Roaring Forties, but it had been of little help. John hadn't really believed him when he had described the devil-driven winds and rain blowing eternally eastwards all around the globe. When they came around the Cape of Good Hope, they would supposedly meet these horrors head on. The change, when it came, had been sudden and shocking, like opening a door to a child's bedroom and finding instead a charnel house. Waves that had been barely more than choppy rose suddenly like cliffs. Unprepared, his hand loose on the pump crank as he stole a moment's rest, John found himself upended and rolling bruisingly down the deck. Brought hard up against some barrels, he screamed in disbelief as a wall of water, grey like a corpse, loomed high over the masts. The bow rose to meet this, but seemed doomed to cartwheel back over the stern. He imagined the ship turning turtle, the waves smashing down on its vulnerable exposed belly, driving them deep and drowning them all. For an eternity the bow struggled up the wavefront, the crew hanging like curtains from quickly snatched handholds. At the very last instant, the bow punched up into the clear air, and for a breathtaking moment, the ship perched precariously atop the crest. The timbers of the bow and stern, now unsupported, groaned like a dying beast, and planks cracked like gunshots. The Fitzgerald hung, all lives on board, in the finest of balances. Then she fell backwards, plummeting down the wave. John lost his grip and fell. The bow crashed into the trough, and tons of water, pulverized to vapor, blasted back over the deck. Suddenly he was the one moving, but the ship had stopped. He crashed into the forecastle, feet first, his legs buckling and forcing his knees up into his face. Everything went dark. He felt his body rolling again. His sight only returned as the ship was halfway up the next monster. The sails, he heard the captain roaring. Each mast had 4 sails, and all were billing backwards in the face of the wind. A terrible drag on the ship, only adding to its chances of turning onto its back. Men weaved like drunkards over the uncertain deck, making for the halyards to lift the lower booms and collapse the sails. "All hands," the mate was yelling. John staggered to his feet, launching himself to port to get a grasp on a rail beside the captain. He was aware of Ping emerging from his galley and then weaving over towards them. The captain was struggling to untie a halyard. Hauling on it would be a 3-man job. John and Ping waited until they reached the moment of balance on the next crest, then they grabbed it just as the halyard came free. They all heaved back on the line as the ship crashed down into the next trough. The overshadowing waves took the wind out of the sail, and the 3 men hauled to lift the boom while they could. Just for a second, John felt a glimmer of hope, but then the ship rose to the next crest. The devils in the wind blew another mighty breath, filling the sail instantly. The halyard was wrenched up, tugging John's arms almost out of their sockets, tearing the rope from his grasp. The captain and Ping lost their grips too, falling to their knees, their hands flattening on the deck to steady themselves. On the other side of the ship, he saw men who had kept hold on their lines being jerked high into the air before pitching over the rail and into the boiling sea. In the twinkling of an eye, an invisible knife slashed right across the sail above them with a terrible ripping sound. John saw instantly what would happen next. He thrust forward, but found himself moving through air that had become thicker than the waters of the Yellow River. As the suddenly unsupported boom fell, he saw Ping and the captain getting to their feet, their heads only now starting to look up. John had choice but no calculation. He charged shoulder first, driving into Ping's midriff, impelling him backwards. They both rode clear as the boom crashed down. The captain had straightened just as the edge of the boom came down on him, smashing his skull, driving his head far down beneath his shoulders. Those shoulders, now unattached, gave one last eloquent shrug as the rest of the body was pounded to the deck, compressed to an unholy mass of blood and bone. The other sailors on the deck had turned their heads at the ripping sound and had seen it all. Now, wonderingly, their eyes bored into Jun. So he's in a bit of trouble for saving a Chinaman rather than the ship's captain. Well, bring it on, ask questions. I dare you, I dare. Dave.
Barrie, I just find that talk amazing. And I'm wondering, have you ever thought of writing a sort of Bill Bryson type travel account?
Wow, thank you, Dave. because Sparsan has agreed to write my next book. I mean, my ideas mainly come from travel, but sadly, for the last 3 years, I've been confined to quarters, you know. And Sparsan liked some of the Facebook posts on the travel that I've done, so they encouraged me to write a travel book, and that will be the next one. I mean, I've travelled all my life. It's a passion. I've travelled as a student, as a sailor, as a scientist, and a senior citizen, and all for the purposes of private, you know. So, and I've got into a lot of trouble over the years because I do like slightly risky, slightly adventurous travel. So I've got plenty to write about. It's a lot funnier than these other books, but yes, and I don't know when it will be coming out. Leslie, are you any idea?
It will be coming out probably towards Christmas 2023.
Okay. But yeah, thank you very much. Phil.
Barrie, this is a family epic, which, if memory serves, is maybe a different way of writing than a lot of the books you've done before. Did you think differently about how you would structure the plot and tackle it, knowing I mean, you know, it's not a 4-volume blockbuster. You can't cover everything in between, but you've got to do something that captures big gaps in time and the way the families work.
Yeah, I mean, also there were 4 different points of view, effectively. It was third-person point of view, but nonetheless it is their points of view, so you had to try and see it through their eyes. I mean, I've certainly visited all the places that I write about in the book, and I took copious notes while we were travelling around, much to my family's disgust. So I've tried to make it sound as authentic as possible. I've tried to do as much research as I could for the different periods: Shanghai in the 1890s, Shanghai in the 1920s, Hong Kong in the 70s, and Taiwan and mainland China now. Yes, it's research. It's the best I can do, but yes. 4 different perspectives is interesting, 4 points of view in a novel. It's challenging, but yeah, it's stretching as well. It's good. It's good. Oh, Douglas.
Don't worry. You talked a wee bit about the current Chinese mastery of technology. When you're down the coast in Scotland, on the west coast, you see our so-called nuclear deterrent, and they swan off down past Ailsa Craig and Arran, and then they go under, and the whole thing is predicated on the idea that once they've gone under, they're undetectable. So we've got 4 of them, only about 2 of them are in commission at any given time, and that's the basis that our entire defence strategy is based on. So I'm not a student of all this like you, which is why I'm asking this question. But I did read recently that the Chinese have got drones, undersea drones, that'll just follow the Vanguard submarines wherever they go, and they go in relay. So we spend all these billions, tens and tens of billions, on that deterrent, and the Chinese have already got drones that'll just follow them, and therefore the entire predication of our deterrent is annulled by these little Chinese drones. Have you done any research into that?
Oh, don't you worry your pretty little head about that. I mean, for a start, drones, what kind of batteries have they got? I mean, drones can fly in the air where there's only air resistance. What about water resistance? I mean, that's gonna limit the range of them. But more generally, the point is, I don't think we should be worried about China in the way that we're worried about Russia. I mean, Russia could use its nuclear weapons, but I don't think China ever would. China's actually quite good in the sense that it hasn't really got a history of invading other countries or really starting wars. The Chinese feel they occupy a privileged position. I mean, Chinese don't call China China, they call it Chung Kuo, which means Middle Kingdom. They feel it's halfway between the earth and heaven. They think they are blessed, really. And they don't, and there's so many of them, and China is so big, there's no need to invade other countries. My worry about China isn't that they'll nuke us. My worry of China is that they will become so far ahead of us, become so much richer than us, that we will envy them. We will want to emulate them. And I'm afraid that we might voluntarily give up many of the freedoms which are so important to us. I just think the Chinese will get so far ahead of us, you know, we will start to feel poor. I think that's the biggest threat to our way of life in those terms. Robin?
I've got an equally serious question, Barry. You've been hopping around the genres in your writing career. When can we expect a romance from you? Which I would totally read, by the way.
Yes, so would I. Oh, you flummoxed me there, Robin. No, that's not on my agenda. I'm afraid that's maybe not playing to my strengths, as my wife would say. Ian?
Does the one family, one child, and the sort of forced sterilizations come into the book at all? Because it was such a, you know, I suppose in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, it was such a big feature of what we knew was going on in China.
Yes, well, there's mention of the Uyghurs in the book. That is one of these repressed minorities in China. Yeah, I mean, they have reversed that policy now. It was 2 children, and it's now, I think, gone up to 3, because they're running into a huge demographic problem. They've got a lot of old people and no young people to deal with it. But no, I don't deal explicitly with the one-child policy in the book, but yeah, it's definitely there in the background. Yeah, that was a terrible, terrible mistake that they made.
Can I ask, were you able to speak to any of the Chinese community in Glasgow or any other area?
Yes, I've tried to pass the book through a few people who actually know something about Chinese families, as opposed to me. Yes. A little favourable. I gave some suggestions as how to change
They
it.
have historically have been quite a closed community.
Yeah.
haven't they?
I've had Chinese people of Chinese extraction. I've read the book and commented on it.
How long did it take you to write the book? How long before you started writing it did you think about writing it?
Well, as soon as I was in China and I got the idea, when I was shocked by how advanced how far they'd advanced in 6 years. I wanted to write it then and there. The book takes me about a year, generally speaking. The travel book took me much less because I had so much writing I'd done over the years in different books that I could bring it all together in one place. But yeah, it takes me about a year to write a book. I used to write 3 hours a day when I retired, but nowadays it's just about an hour a day, really. That's as much
Make
as
it more.